La-de-fucking-da. Between 1850 and 2023, human emissions totaled approximately 2,500 gigatons. Between 2000 and 2024, we emitted 814.19 gigatons of carbon dioxide per one source, while others vary by a few gigatons in either direction. Say, both of those numbers are incredibly close to what we guesstimated. Class dismissed. The only other possibility that I've ever heard advocated for, and so I literally cannot look at any other claim because there are none, is that volcanic activity is responsible for CO2 emissions. There are several problems with this hypothesis from the outset. First, why would volcanic activity be relatively near completely stable for a period of thousands of years, during which we know there are numerous eruptions? Pompeii, anyone? And then suddenly shift to completely overloaded activity. Second, why would every other period of time for which natural carbon dioxide is emitted by volcanic activity take 10, 100, even 1,000 times slower than what we are experiencing right now? Third, what eruptions? Fourth, where is literally any other symptom of such widespread volcanic activity? And lastly, volcanic activity emits 0.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide annually. To put it another way, 2024 human emissions were 63 times greater than volcanic output. At best, some people say that, oh, we just don't know, but we do know! It is right there. We can measure it. We literally watch it happen. There is no other explanation. There is no other source of emissions that can even come close to anthropogenic emissions. Moreover, there are absolutely none, nor any combination of other sources, that so perfectly fits the data. To provide any sort of substantive, worthwhile hypothesis, much less an actual workable idea that has even a chance of verification, you would need to do three things all at once. You need to demonstrate where our 2,500 gigatons of CO2 emissions went, if they never stayed in the atmosphere, and clearly they're not fully contained by the ocean or the land. You would need to demonstrate what other source is causing these emissions, why that source has never occurred before in measurable geologic history, and why it is happening here and now. And you would need to demonstrate why there are no other indicators, no other symptoms, no corollary effects, no detectable point of emission, etc. Anthropogenic emissions is the only hypothesis to which all the evidence points, that fits all of the data, that has no extraneous loose ends, and has no unanswered questions. It is perfectly holistic and holistically parsimonious. I really did, to make this part a whole, how shall we say, thing. I would go over every competing idea, every claim, look at their emissions, and glibly go, well, that one doesn't quite fit, how about... and on until I reached human emissions, at which point I'd say something to the effect of, well, would you look at that? It seems to fit our models perfectly. I guess that must be our answer. But volcanic activity is really the only other claim I've encountered, and it cannot even hold up to the most basic level of scrutiny. The preponderance of evidence is so overwhelming that I cannot even pretend to entertain alternatives, because no one can even meaningfully propose alternatives. Anything which relies on completely nebulous and undefined natural cycles couldn't even withstand the question, where is the carbon dioxide coming from? Honestly, it's like the wind has been taken from my sails. After all this momentum, this build-up, my grand finale is met with nothing. It's sad, both for me, who was looking forward to one last hurrah, and for the world, that a conspiracy theory that cannot even answer the most basic questions, cannot account for the most basics of science, cannot do anything, has somehow convinced half the population of the US and multiple presidents. But there is one other thing they say, isn't there? Sure, it is often cushioned within verifiably false scientific claims, as has been discussed. It is couched within questioning the narrative that amounts to little more than misunderstanding physics, chemistry, whatever it takes to make it sound convincing. It's this idea that the data isn't even real to begin with, that climate activists are being paid, are being funded by shadowy orgs for the purposes of their evil agenda, and that none of these things are real to begin with, and frankly, I'm still waiting for my check. Sure, we can say carbon dioxide absorbs specific wavelengths of infrared light, but any data about how much we've actually emitting into the atmosphere is obviously fabricated. Any data we have on the melting ice is obviously fabricated. I will entertain this hypothesis on three as yet unmet conditions. 1. There is evidence of this funding for political purposes. 2. There is real, legitimate data that is being systematically hidden. And 3. There is produced a legitimate model that can account for all of the real data points, whatever those are concluded to be. That is the minimum to expect from such a grand claim. If you believe this, the ball is now in your court. And if you can't meet those 3 conditions, why not? Because if they are all being funded for political purposes, surely there's evidence, or else how would you know? Surely there's evidence of the real data, or else how would you know it exists? Surely there's some better model, because there's real data, then we can model it. But, wait just a moment. Before you go, let's play the game a little longer. Because you're right about one thing. Scientists, politicians, organizations, companies, they're all people. And people can be bought. We should follow the money. We should follow the influence, the power. We should see who stands to benefit from what. Your concerns are not unfounded. There are, as I see it, 2 possibilities. Either climate change is anthropogenic, or it is not. But no matter the truth value of either state of things, there are, in theory, ulterior motives for claiming one or the other. That is, whether or not it's anthropogenic, someone might benefit from saying it is, or from saying it isn't. So I ask, who benefits from saying that climate change is anthropogenic? Certainly not me. Again, I'm still waiting on my check. Certainly not scientists as a group. Without evidence, it cannot be entertained that they are being paid to lie. Completely regardless of that claim, though, we are seeking some sort of intrinsic benefit from the populace believing the narrative, and there is no such benefit for scientists. There are no major corporate interest groups who benefit from the narrative. At absolute best, there are relatively minor businesses who are developing technology in response. But can we really expect a solar panel manufacturer to have the capital necessary to convince 99% of scientists to lie for their benefit? Tesla may benefit, as certainly much of their subsidies are for the promise of environmentally friendly transportation. But that narrative is neither necessary, given that Tesla also has the angles of reducing pollution and just creating more energy-efficient vehicles than gas power overall, nor is it sufficient, as Musk himself actively rallies against any sort of market intervention in support of green energy. Nor even is Tesla concerned with where the energy comes from for their electric vehicles, only that there is electricity. It's more parsimonious to say that they benefit from uneducated fear of climate change, as truly environmentally conscious individuals would still demand that the source of energy be clean and not just burned from coal down the street. What do the governments have to gain? Governments, like corporations, are interested in power and resources, and through those resources, more power, and through that power, more resources. At times, under the right circumstances, the state will also have an interest in the welfare of its people, though more often than not they assume that power and resources and the welfare of its people are one and the same. Moreover, given that this whole discussion is about actively lying about reality, we can be assured that any governmental interests involve power and resources. Through what channel does the belief in anthropogenic climate change give them either? There are proposals here and there for things such as a carbon tax or regulations on businesses to ensure environmental practices. Yet I would hesitate to call these increases in power so much greater than any other tax regulation, of which we already have dozens and thousands respectively, that they would or even could concoct this global conspiracy involving just about every single scientist and to fudge literally every single point of relevant data and to fake this whole thing. Moreover, this notion is, at times, patently ridiculous for one main reason. The political groups that are advancing anthropogenic climate change routinely advance the need for green, renewable energy. Primarily, this is in the forms of solar at the forefront, then wind, then hydroelectric. Solar especially is a fascination, because by advancing the need for solar, they are actively surrendering power and influence. Solar is a source of energy that provides energy independence for individual homes, businesses, even entire communities. No longer must the people depend on some larger entity for survival. Moreover, by advancing electric vehicles powered by these renewable energy resources, the state is also surrendering their very, very lucrative tax on gas. And by transitioning to renewable energies, they'd be foregoing their carbon tax that they just gained anyway because it would become, by and large, obsolete. So what, really, does a given political group gain by advancing this belief? Who benefits? Because it's not you. It's not any major industrial bloc, given that the renewable energy sector, although it absolutely does have significant lobbying presence, spent half of that of the real estate industry of all things. It's not the scientists who have been saying the same thing for multiple decades, and in some cases literal centuries. It's not even government.
So, you want to follow the money? Follow the incentives? Find out who benefits? Who benefits from saying man-made climate change is fake? Cut the music. Cut the lights. Let's find out who benefits. Climate science is not a new science. It is not a new interest, nor a new project, undertaken only recently, spurred by being suddenly caught off guard. In 1960, Charles Keeling, of the Mauna Loa Observatory fame, reported that the atmospheric concentration of CO2 was drastically rising in the South Pole. His measurements began in 1957. Before this, even, the American Petroleum Institute, or the API, the main trade association for oil and adjacent companies, was made aware that such an effect was possible. And when US President Lyndon Johnson's Science Advisory Committee warned of global warming in 1965, the petroleum industry's main trade association, the American Petroleum Institute, relayed the warning to its members. General Motors and Ford were presented with contemporary cutting-edge research throughout the 1960s and 1970s demonstrating that fossil fuel emissions could and would drive global warming. Electric utilities were warned by scientists by 1968. Total, an energy company based in France, was a member of the API, and received SAC's warning. More than that, their own internal documents and research demonstrated their awareness and acceptance of the science. Researchers, whose names I shall now egregiously mispronounce, Christophe Bonneuil and Pierre-Louis Chouquet, and Benjamin Franta, uncovered that, in 1971, the company magazine included an article titled Atmospheric Pollution and Climate. They excerpt the following. Since the 19th century, humans have been burning increasing amounts of fossil fuels. This results in the release of enormous quantities of carbon dioxide. The overall amount of carbon dioxide present in the atmosphere, therefore, has increased significantly. The increase has been around 15% over the last 150 years, which is not negligible. And, if the consumption of coal and oil keeps the same rhythm in the years to come, the concentration of carbon dioxide will reach 400 parts per million around 2010. This increase in concentration is quite worrying. Carbon dioxide plays a large role in the thermal balance of the atmosphere. Air richer in carbon dioxide absorbs more radiation and heats up. It is possible, therefore, that an increase in the average temperature of the atmosphere is to be feared. The calculated orders of magnitude are obviously small, from 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but could have important impacts. Atmospheric circulation could be modified, and it is not impossible, according to some, to foresee at least a partial melting of the polar ice caps, which would certainly result in significant sea level rise. The catastrophic consequences are easy to imagine. Total's predictions proved accurate, of course. We breached 400 parts per million daily average in 2013. Southern Company had a report by 1980. Furley's review warned of the possible negative impacts that could result from global warming caused by a doubling of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere, including the melting of the polar caps, rising sea levels, and massive extinction of plant and animal species due to rapid climate change. Exxon was warned by their internal scientists in 1977 about the dangers and future of anthropogenic climate change. In 1982, Exxon commissioned, funded, and created their own model and projections of atmospheric carbon dioxide and the warning therefrom. Recently, scientists tested Exxon's 40-year-old predictions. Our results show that in private and academic circles since the late 1970s and early 1980s, ExxonMobil predicted global warming correctly and skillfully. Using established statistical techniques, we find that 63 to 83% of the climate projections reported by ExxonMobil scientists were accurate in predicting subsequent global warming. ExxonMobil's average projected warming was 0.2 degrees plus or minus 0.04 degrees Celsius per decade, which is, within uncertainty, the same as that of independent academic and government projections published between 1970 and 2007. The average skill score and level of uncertainty of ExxonMobil's climate models, 67 to 75% and plus or minus 21% respectively, were also similar to those of the independent models. Moreover, we show that ExxonMobil scientists correctly dismissed the possibility of a coming ice age in favor of a carbon dioxide-induced superinterglacial, accurately predicted the human-caused global warming would first be detectable in the year 2000 plus or minus 5, and reasonably estimated how much CO2 would lead to dangerous warming. Internal documents by Shell reveal that they, too, knew the risks by the 1980s. How do you suppose these corporations and their associated interests group used this knowledge? In 1975, Total described environmentalists as caught in a trap of nostalgia. 1986, Bernard Tremier, then the environmental director of ELF, another French fossil fuel company with close relations to Total that would eventually be subsumed by Total, wrote, "The problems related to the interactions of various pollutants in the upper atmosphere will become of concern in the coming years. The case of ozone is already known, but the accumulation of CO2 and CH4 in the atmosphere and the resulting greenhouse effect will inevitably modify our environment. All models are unanimous in predicting global warming, but the magnitude of the phenomenon remains undetermined. The first reactions have been, of course, to tax fossil fuels, so it is obvious that the industry will once again have to prepare to defend itself." 1968, an internal memo from Exxon says, under the heading Exxon Position, emphasize the uncertainty in scientific conclusions regarding the potential enhanced greenhouse effect. Resist the overstatement and sensationalization of potential greenhouse effect, which could lead to non-economic development of non-fossil fuel resources. The so-called Global Climate Coalition was a lobbying group formed in 1989. Founding members included Exxon, Edison Electric Institute, National Coal Association, American Petroleum Institute, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and American Forest and Paper Association. Other important members included BP, Shell, Chevron, Mobil, and just about every major fossil fuel core you can think of. This lobby group would go on to spend millions of dollars fighting any sort of environmental legislation and promoting and sowing doubt about climate science. Quote, GCC's advocacy activities included lobbying government officials, grassroots lobbying through press releases and advertising, participation in international climate conferences, criticism of the processes of international climate organizations, critiques of climate models, and personal attacks on scientists and environmentalists. Policy positions advocated by the coalition included denial of anthropogenic climate change, emphasizing the uncertainty in climatology, advocating for additional research, highlighting the benefits and downplaying the risks of climate change, stressing the priority of economic development, and defending national sovereignty, and opposition to the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. In 1991, U.S. coal companies formed a front group called the Information Council for the Environment, or ICE. How serendipitous. It was associated with and run by a variety of groups, including but not limited to Edison Electric Institute, Southern Company, Western Fuels Association, National Coal Association, and Peabody Energy. And fortunately for us, they had a lot of internal documents leaked to the public. In one such document, they listed their strategies. Their number one strategy was reposition global warming as theory, in parentheses, not fact. They also intended to get a spokesperson from the scientific community. They also spent months and money determining how best to change people's opinions to be favorable to the industry. As one snippet says, technical sources also favor choosing the Information Council on the Environment as a title for ICE, since this organization is perceived as a technical source, while Informed Citizens for the Environment carries both technical and activist connotations. As a general strategy, we recommend that ICE concentrate on comparing possible solutions to the global warming problem, focusing in particular on the proper role of government, the need for research, and the costliness of inappropriate or premature legislation. The audience for those messages needs to see its personal stake in the issue if they are to become actively engaged and committed. More specifically, the results of this study point toward two possible audiences. One possible target audience includes those who are most receptive to messaging describing the motivation and vested interests of people currently making pronouncements on global warming. For example, the statement that some members of the media scare the public about global warming to increase their audience and their influence. People who respond most favorably to such statements are older, less educated males from larger households who are not typically active information seekers and are not likely to be green consumers. Members of this group are skeptical about global warming, predisposed to favor the ICE agenda, and likely to be even more supportive of the agenda following exposure to new information. They are not, however, accustomed to taking political action. They are good targets for radio advertisements. Another possible target segment is younger, lower-income women. These women are more receptive than other audience segments to factual information concerning the evidence for global warming. They are likely to be green consumers, to believe that the Earth is warming, and to think the problem is serious. However, they are also likely to soften support for federal legislation after hearing new information on global warming. These women are good targets for magazine advertisements. A campaign strategy reaching out to these targets groups can help to change attitudes where change is most likely to occur, and also to strengthen support among favorable members of the public. They then proceeded to run a climate change denial ad campaign with a budget of $510,000, which today would be $1.2 million. They ran ads such as, global warming! I know you've been seeing more and more stories about the global warming theory. Stories that paint a horrible picture. Stories that say the polar ice caps will melt. Stories that say the Earth is headed for catastrophe. Well, get real. Stop panicking. I'm here to tell you that the facts simply don't jibe with the theory that catastrophic global warming is taking place. Try this fact on for size. Minneapolis has actually gotten colder. So has Albany, New York, and the Department of Agriculture says that on both coasts of this country, winter temperatures are 5 to 10 degrees colder than previously reported. So, folks, grab hold of yourselves and get this whole story before you make up your mind. Right now, you can get a free packet of easy-to-understand material about global warming. Just call this number. That's the Information Council for the Environment. After you read the free materials they send you, you'll have a better picture of what the facts are all about. Call today, because the best environmental policy is based on fact. The most serious problem with catastrophic global warming is, it may not be true. Who told you the Earth was warming? Chicken Little? Chicken Little's hysteria about the sky falling down was based on a fact that got spun out of proportion. It's the same with global warming. There's no hard evidence it is occurring. In fact, evidence the Earth is warming is weak. Proof that carbon dioxide has been the primary cause is non-existent. Climate models cannot accurately predict far future climate change, and the underlying physics of climatic change are still wide open for debate. If you care about the Earth and don't want your imagination to run away with you, make sure you get the facts. Doomsday is cancelled. Again. The 20th century has seen many predictions of global destruction. In the 1930s, some scientists claimed we were in the middle of a disastrous warming trend. In the mid-1970s, others were sure we were entering a new ice age, and so on. It's the same with global warming. There's no hard evidence it is occurring. In fact, evidence for the Earth is warming is weak. Proof that carbon dioxide has been the primary cause is non-existent. Climate models cannot accurately predict far future global change, etc., etc. And this is despite their own internal documents saying that warming was occurring. Total's environmental director in 1992 took lessons from Exxon's production of doubt, and said in their corporate magazine, quote, "Certainly, there is a relationship between the temperature and carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere, but this relationship does not allow an extrapolation leading to more or less catastrophic scenarios on global warming of the planet, and above all, there is no certainty about the impact of human activities, including the combustion of fossil fuels." At the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio, Total gave out material saying, "The considerable progress made in climatology since the beginning of the century has not allowed us to dispel the uncertainties regarding the greenhouse effect," and insisting that energy policies should ensure the growth of developing countries, even if it means increasing greenhouse gas emissions to start. While ELF, the day after, said, "Thus, to the still unknown question of the greenhouse effect, we cannot answer hastily by taxing only European industrials, because we think, without being sure, that carbon dioxide emissions could lead to warming of the planet in the years to come." And just 2 months after that, Total's honorary president spoke at the Congress of the World Energy Council. He called warming predictions of 2 degrees Celsius in the 21st century dubious, stating, "Natural sources are much greater than man-made sources. We still have much work to do to understand the complete carbon dioxide cycle, the role of the ocean depths and the biosphere. Scholars are divided on this. Hippocrates says yes, Galen says no. There is some doubt." That same year, still, a very prominent and otherwise popular eco-tax was defeated after being advanced in Europe for some time. Total and ELF, of course, were involved. Geralt penned an internal report. In his report, Geralt welcomed the tax's recent failure, crediting the company's lobbying activities and carried out through hidden direct contacts with the ministerial cabinets and administrations, both in France, Prime Minister, Finance, Environment Research at European Affairs, and in the European Economic Community. Tremere recalled that Total was better than us in developing lobbying activities in Brussels, where a full-time employee was positioned. The failure of the eco-tax undermined Europe's position at the Rio summit, contributing to limiting the scope and ambition of the UN process, which Geralt reviewed as a success for the company. In March 1993, Francis Geralt, Director of Foresight, Economics and Strategy at ELF and close advisor to the company's CEOs, wrote an internal report addressed to the company board called Greenhouse Effect: Proposal for an Action Plan, in which he explicitly advocated for an aggressive strategy of doubt. In order to resist hasty decisions regarding fossil fuels, Geralt proposed in his plan that the company promote the notion that there are scientific doubts about the greenhouse effect, as well as identify and support renowned scientists who can intervene positively in the debate. The GCC was also at that Rio conference, lobbying to keep any sort of specific targets outside of the UN's Framework Convention. In December of that year, the GCC's executive director wrote to the New York Times, "There is considerable debate on whether or not man-made greenhouse gases, produced primarily by burning fossil fuels, are triggering a dangerous global warming trend." Another part of their lobbying efforts was distributing a video to hundreds of journalists, the White House, and several Middle Eastern oil-producing countries, suggesting that high levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were beneficial for crop production and could be the solution to world hunger. Their lobbying was also instrumental to defeating Clinton's 1994 BTU tax proposal. And then we get to the year 1995. This is a very important year for one simple reason. The GCC circulated a document called Predicting Future Climate Change, a primer. This was written by in-house scientists, and we have access to it. I need to preface this, however. Up until this point, if we would be willing to, for one bad reason or another, give these people the utmost benefit of doubt, it can be argued, however perniciously, that they were truly interested in providing a balanced coverage, that they were truly intending to put a light to the doubts that other scientists were ignoring or hand-waving away. That ends now. Introduction and summary. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, human activities have increased the atmospheric concentration of CO2 by more than 25%. Atmospheric concentrations of other greenhouse gases have also risen. Over the past 120 years, global average temperature has risen by 0.3 to 0.6 degrees Celsius. Since the greenhouse effect can be used to relate atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases to global average temperatures, claims have been made that at least part of the temperature rise experienced to date is due to human activities, and that the projected future increases in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gas, as the result of human activities, will lead to even larger increases in future temperatures. Additionally, it is claimed that these increases in temperature will lead to an array of climate changes, rainfall patterns, storm frequency and intensity, etc., that could have severe environmental and economic impacts. This primer addresses the following questions concerning climate change. Can human activities affect climate? The scientific basis for the greenhouse effect and the potential impact of human emissions of greenhouse gases such as CO2 on climate is well established and cannot be denied. The energy absorbed by the Earth's surface is re-radiated to space as long-wave radiation. A fraction of this re-radiated energy is absorbed by greenhouse gases, a phenomenon known as the greenhouse effect. Greenhouse gases are trace gases, such as water vapor, CO2, methane, etc., which have the ability to absorb long-wave radiation. When a greenhouse gas molecule absorbs long-wave energy, it heats up, then radiates energy in all directions, including back down to the Earth's surface. The energy radiated back to the Earth's surface by greenhouse gas molecules is the greenhouse effect that further warms the surface. The warmer the surface of the Earth, the more energy it re-radiates. The higher the concentration of greenhouse gases, the more energy they will absorb, and the more they will warm the Earth. The average temperature of the Earth depends on the balance between these two phenomena. Naturally occurring greenhouse gases, predominantly water vapor, account for 95 to 97% of the current greenhouse effect. They raise the average temperature of Earth's surface by about 30 degrees Celsius. Without this natural greenhouse effect, the Earth would probably be uninhabitable. The science of the greenhouse effect is well established and can be demonstrated in the laboratory. Human activities can affect the energy balance at the Earth's surface in 3 ways. Combustion, agriculture, and other human activities emit greenhouse gases and can raise their concentration in the atmosphere, which would directionally lead to warming. Combustion emits particulates and gases such as sulfur dioxide, which form particulate matter in the atmosphere, which would directionally lead to cooling. And changes in land use, such as removing forests, can change the amount of energy absorbed by the Earth's surface, the rate of water evaporation, and other parameters involved in the climate system, which could result in either warming or cooling. These 3 factors create the potential for a human impact on climate. The potential for a human impact on climate is based on well-established scientific fact and should not be denied. While, in theory, human activities have the potential to result in net cooling, a concern about 25 years ago, the current balance between greenhouse gas emissions and the emissions of particulates and particulate formers is such that essentially all of today's concern is about net warming. Are there alternate explanations for the climate change which has occurred over the last 120 years? Several arguments have been put forward attempting to challenge the conventional view of greenhouse gas-induced climate change. These are generally referred to as contrarian theories. This section summarizes these theories and the counterarguments presented against them.
Contrarian theory. Solar radiation is the driver for the climate system. Any change in the intensity of the solar radiation reaching the Earth will affect temperature and other climate parameters. Dr. Robert Jastrow, director of the Mount Wilson Observatory, and others have shown a close correlation between various sunspot parameters, which they believe are a measure of solar intensity and global average temperature for the past 120 years, the period for which reasonable quality data exists for both sunspots and global average temperature. The correlation has been pushed back to about 1700, using less accurate data for both temperature and sunspots. In addition, observation of sun-like stars indicates that they show the amount of variability in radiation intensity needed to account for recent changes in the Earth's climate. Counterarguments, and keep this in mind for later. Direct measures of the intensity of solar radiation over the past 15 years indicate a maximum variability of less than 0.1%, sufficient to account for no more than 0.1 degrees Celsius temperature change. This period of direct measurement included one complete 11-year sunspot cycle, which allowed for development of a correlation between solar intensity and the fraction of the sun's surface covered by sunspots. Applying this correlation to sunspot data for the past 120 years indicates a maximum variability on solar intensity of 0.1%, corresponding to a maximum temperature change of 0.1 degrees Celsius, 1/5 of the temperature change observed during this period. If solar variability has accounted for 0.1 degrees Celsius temperature increase in the last 120 years, it is an interesting finding, but it does not allay concerns about future warming which could result from greenhouse gas emissions. Whatever contribution solar variability makes to climate change should be additive to the effect of greenhouse gas emissions. The contrarian theories raise interesting questions about our total understanding of climate processes, but they do not offer convincing arguments against the conventional model of greenhouse gas emissions-induced climate change. Jastro's hypothesis about the role of solar variability and Michael's questions about the temperature record are not convincing arguments against any conclusion that we are currently experiencing warming as a result of greenhouse gas emissions. However, neither solar variability nor anomalies in the temperature record offer a mechanism for offsetting the much larger rise in temperature which might occur if the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases were to double or quadruple. Linden's hypothesis that any warming would create more rain, which would cool and dry the upper troposphere, did offer a mechanism for balancing the effect of increased greenhouse gases. However, the data supporting this hypothesis is weak, and even Linden has stopped presenting it as an alternative to the conventional model of climate change. At this point in time, they know unequivocally. Their own scientists are saying it. Their own models are reporting it. Their own documents are telling it. Their own conversations are invoking it. I'll ask again. What do you think they did with this information? In 2009, Senior Vice President for the Chamber of Commerce called for putting the science of climate change on trial, even as the organization was making the case to the Environmental Protection Agency that global warming would be beneficial to humans. And despite warnings from their own scientific committee that continued fossil fuel production expansion would lead to globally catastrophic events, API helped lead industry-wide efforts to spread disinformation and fight climate policies. In 2004, BP hired a PR firm to create the concept of an individual carbon footprint, to make the case that consumers, not producers, are responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions caused by fossil fuels, and that consumers, not producers, are responsible for fixing the problem. The CEO of Chevron even defended a recent decision to enrich shareholders through stock buybacks, rather than investing it in wind and solar projects by saying, "We'd rather dividend back to shareholders and let them plant trees." In 2020, BP set an ambition to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, but the pledge has some major carve-outs that make it functionally meaningless. The company's calculation excludes more than 40% of its oil production and 15% of the gas, and all of the oil and gas extracted by other companies that is processed and resold by BP. A recent report found that Shell is on track to miss its own pollution reduction targets after 2022. The company has so grossly overstated its moves to reduce carbon pollution that a Netherlands watchdog directed Shell to pull ads it was running on its carbon neutrality program because they were misleading. Exxon's current climate pledge focuses on the carbon intensity of its operations rather than its net emissions, meaning that the company's climate plan would actually allow it to increase its carbon footprint over time. This type of pledge amounts to little more than a useful talking point for Exxon executives on climate action, even as the company remains committed to expanding oil and gas production. Only 0.2% of Chevron's capital expenditures between 2010 and 2018 were in low-carbon energy sources, and the company's net production of high-carbon sources, including crude oil, natural gas, and oil equivalent, all increased in 2019 compared to previous years. In 2020, API launched Energy for Progress, a massive PR campaign that portrayed fossil fuel companies as heroes in the fight to defeat the climate crisis, even while it was actively opposing climate action efforts in states across the country. More recently, API has endorsed a new set of climate policies, including a carbon tax which industry lobbyist Keith McCoy described as a convenient talking point to misdirect from more viable climate action policies. In the past few years, the American Petroleum Institute and its allies have fought against climate-friendly policies in at least 16 different states. BP publicly endorsed a carbon tax and then spent $13 million fighting against that exact policy. And here's something quite fun. Undercover reporters at Unearthed managed to speak to and get a lot of information from two of Exxon's top lobbyists in 2021. He described Biden's new plan to slash US greenhouse gas emissions as insane, and admitted that the company had aggressively fought early climate science through shadow groups to protect its investments. Keith McCoy, a senior director Keith McCoy, a senior director in Exxon's Washington, D.C. government affairs team, told the undercover reporter that he is speaking to the office of influential Democratic Senator Joe Manchin every week, with the aim of drastically reducing the scope of Biden's climate plan so that negative stuff, such as rules limiting greenhouse gas emissions and taxes on oil companies, are removed. McCoy suggested that Exxon's public support for a carbon tax as its principal climate policy is an advocacy tool and great talking point that will never actually happen. Nobody is going to propose a tax on all Americans, and the cynical side of me says, yeah, we kind of know that, but it gives us a talking point that we can say, well, what is ExxonMobil for? Well, we're for a carbon tax, McCoy said. A second Exxon lobbyist, Dan Easley, who left the company in January after working as its chief White House lobbyist throughout the Trump administration, laughed when asked by an undercover reporter if the company had achieved many policy wins under Trump, before outlining victories on fossil fuel permitting and the renegotiation of the NAFTA trade agreement. The wins are such that it would be difficult to categorize them all, he said, adding that the biggest victory was Trump's reduction in the corporate tax rate, which was probably worth billions to Exxon. Exxon continues to deny having misled the public on climate change, and no serving Exxon executive has ever admitted that the company fought climate change science to protect the company's financial interests. Until now. McCoy told an undercover Unearthed reporter that although he didn't believe Exxon had buried its own science, the company had cast doubt on the scientific consensus. Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes. Did we hide our science? Absolutely not. Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. But there's nothing illegal about that. You know, we were looking out for our investments. We were looking out for our shareholders. The reference to shadow groups is likely to relate to a powerful network of think tanks and pressure groups through which Exxon fought both the science and political action on climate change. Between 1998 and 2014, the company spent at least $30 million funding climate denial groups, such as the Heartland Institute, Competitive Enterprise Institute, and Heritage Foundation. This network played a critical role in shifting the Republican Party from a position of support for action to cut emissions in the 1980s to its near-total opposition to tackling climate change from the mid-1990s to today. Instead of subsidizing renewables, governments should prioritize research and development to discover a breakthrough technology. In the meantime, Exxon would remain fundamentally an oil and gas company because we think that's what society needs and will have to have for the next 50 years, Tillerson said. Crucially, Tillerson explicitly framed the company's support for a carbon tax in opposition to the incoming Obama administration's plan to introduce a more stringent cap and trade system. Essentially, Exxon backed a carbon tax as part of its strategy to oppose cap and trade. In 2013, after the cap and trade bill had been defeated, Tillerson backtracked. As to our advocacy around a carbon tax, I would not support putting a carbon tax in place today because I think we still have a lot of gains to be made through technology and other less intrusive policies. When asked by the reporter, so it's basically never going to happen, right? Is the calculation? McCoy replied, yeah, no, it's not. It's not. Carbon tax is not going to happen. He added that other members of the industry that have recently announced their support for a carbon tax, such as the American Petroleum Institute, an influential lobby group, did so because they've got nothing else, so it's an easy talking point to say, look, I'm for a carbon tax. McCoy continued, so that's the talking point. That is in my mind an effective advocacy tool. Many members of Congress can say, well, we don't believe you, and we'll say, well, yeah, we've been saying this for over a decade, and we're not new to this. API is new to this, some of these other companies are new to this, but at ExxonMobil, we've been saying this for a decade. One of the threats facing Exxon, according to McCoy, is President Biden's proposal to pour billions of dollars into renewable energy and electric vehicles through the $2 trillion American Jobs Plan, his flagship initiative to tackle climate change. A core objective for Exxon on Capitol Hill is undermining confidence that the transition to clean energy and transport is possible over the next decade, according to McCoy. You're not going to be able to just switch to battery-operated vehicles or land for your electricity, and it's having that conversation around why that's not possible in the next 10 years is critically important to the work that we do. And that's at every phase. That's in the Senate, that's in the House, that's with the administration, he said. Let's talk about some of that long history of denial and obfuscation proceeding from 1995. The researchers who took a look at Exxon's previously mentioned climate projections also collected a few of Exxon's public statements. In 2000, ExxonMobil Corp. CEO Lee Raymond wrote that, "We do not now have a sufficient scientific understanding of climate change to make reasonable predictions and/or justify drastic measures. The science of climate change is uncertain." The report speculated about a natural period of warming, solar activity, and volcanic eruptions, El Niño. With all this natural climate noise and the complexities of measurement, it said, science is not now able to confirm that fossil fuel use has led to any significant global warming. In 2001, an ExxonMobil core press release that the hockey stick graph showing anthropogenic global warming, the error bars are huge, yet some prefer to ignore them. In 2005, Lee Raymond said in a television interview, "There is a natural variability that has nothing to do with man. It has to do with sunspots, with the wobble of the Earth. The science is not there to make that determination as to whether global warming is human-caused. There are a lot of other scientists that do not agree with the National Academy and IPCC. The data is not compelling." In 2007, ExxonMobil Corps' website stated that gaps in the scientific basis for theoretical climate models and the interplay of significant natural variability make it very difficult to determine objectively the extent in which recent climate change might be the result of human actions. In 2013, ExxonMobil Corps CEO Rex Tillerson said, "The facts remain that there are uncertainties around the climate, what the principal drivers of climate change are. There are other elements of the climate system that may obviate this one single variable of burning fossil fuels, and so that's that uncertainty issue." ExxonMobil has often specifically claimed or suggested in public that climate models are unreliable. In 1999, for example, ExxonMobil Corps' chief executive officer, Lee Raymond, said future climate projections are based on completely unproven climate models, or more often, sheer speculation. In 2013, his successor, Rex Tillerson, called climate models not competent. In 2015, he stated, "We do not really know what the climate effects of 600 ppm versus 450 ppm will be because the models simply are not that good." The company's own modeling contradicts such statements. Exxon's 1982 projection showed in Figure 1, again recall earlier, for example, suggests that 600 ppm of atmospheric CO2 would lead to 1.3 degrees more global warming than 450 parts per million. Shell and BP ended up leaving the GCC in 1997, with a senior Shell employee later explaining that the company didn't want to fall into the same trap as the tobacco companies, who had become trapped in all their lies. In 1999, Total merged with Elf and another company. Quote from the paper again, "In 2002, the company held its first official internal seminar dedicated to sustainable development. There, in a question and answer session with top managers, the company's new CEO, Thierry Desmarais, continued to promote uncertainty. Of course, the scientific evidence is not always convincing and is sometimes questionable. This said, I think we have reached a point where a certain level of precautionary principle needs to be taken into account. Thus, in terms of global warming, a certain moderation in emission levels of pollutants is, at the stage of our knowledge, desirable." While Desmarais' support of a precautionary principle suggests a heightened level of care, in effect it rhetorically framed climate policies as discretionary precautions rather than needed preventions. This approach of acknowledging the existence of global warming while downplaying its urgency and scientific certainty continued throughout the early 2000s. In 2002, Total's first sustainability report framed climate change in ambiguous terms, noting, "Without the greenhouse effect, there would be no life on our planet, and water vapor is the main greenhouse gas." The report's glossary described the greenhouse effect as a natural phenomenon and equivocally reported that emissions due to human activities could be the origin of climate change, thus ignoring the detection confirmed by the IPCC's second assessment report in 1996. The 2003 report also emphasized uncertainties and described the greenhouse effect merely as the hypothesis most commonly accepted by specialists and national governments within the IPCC. The 2004 report attributed the intensifying greenhouse effect to vague human activity, insisted uncertainties persist on the origin and evolution of the phenomenon, and suggested the evidence for anthropogenic climate change consisted primarily of a mere correlation between greenhouse gas concentrations and average global temperature, both deflecting attention away from the company's products and ignoring the causal links provided by physical sciences and statistical attribution research. Meanwhile, the company continued to spend the bulk of its capital expenditures on upstream oil and gas production, more than $30 billion from 2000 to 2005, without reporting the sum of its few scattered investments in non-fossil energy resources. This fossil fuel-focused strategy was broadly in line with those of other major fossil fuel companies, including ExxonMobil. With pressure mounting, Total eventually had to concede and accept the reality of the science. If you think this means they changed anything, you haven't been following along. Thus, as it vocally supported the IPCC, the company invested more than $60 billion in upstream oil and gas operations from 2005 to 2009, again without reporting significant aggregate investments in non-fossil energy resources. In 2011, a coalition of Total shareholders organized to file a resolution at the company's annual meeting requesting disclosure of the environmental and climatic impacts of the company's Canadian tar sands operations. Yet Total's board and CEO, Christophe DeMargerie, successfully maneuvered to prevent the shareholders from filing the resolution. Meanwhile, Total continued to invest heavily in oil and gas. From 2010 to 2014, the company injected approximately $127 billion in upstream exploration and production, while channeling no more than $3 billion toward non-fossil fuel energy sources. Total also began emphasizing future reductions in product carbon intensity. In 2016, 3 months after the Paris Agreement was signed, the company's CEO, Patrick Pouyanné, presented One Total 2035, a roadmap for reducing the carbon intensity of its products. Yet the 2015 to 2019 period was marked by sustained capital expenditures of $77 billion in upstream oil and gas production. In comparison, investments in non-fossil energy sources did not exceed $5 billion. Without binding controls on the evolution of its energy mix, Total promotes itself as environmentally responsible through future scenarios reports, which the company has issued since 2016. Regular updates to these reports generate a flow of complex, technical information that is difficult to interpret or challenge, helping Total to put the burden of proof on its critics and keep the upper hand in climate controversies. And these, unfortunately, are not even the worst of it. Dr. Wei-Hak Soon worked at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. He made a very controversial, but thusly a very loud name for himself by challenging anthropogenic climate change in favor of explanation by solar cycles. Of course, his study and research methods have been criticized in many, many ways by the scientific community. That's not the interesting part. No. You see, his research was funded to the tune of $1.2 million by fossil fuel interests. The documents, obtained through a FOIA request by Greenpeace and the Climate Investigation Center, show that Wei-Hak Willie Soon received more than $1.2 million in research funding between 2001 and 2012 from fossil fuel interests including ExxonMobil, the American Petroleum Institute, the Charles Koch Foundation, and Southern Company, a large electric utility in Atlanta that generates most of its power from coal. Soon, whose background is not in climate science but rather in aerospace engineering, has long used his affiliation with the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics to add credence to his climate-related research. Soon has written about many aspects of climate change, but is best known for his work on the role of solar variability, research that has broadly overstated the role the sun plays in climate change and has been largely discredited by his scientific peers. Outcry from the climate science community over a 2003 paper published by Soon in Climate Research even resulted in the resignation of several of the journal editors and an admission by the journal's publisher that the paper should not have been accepted. Here is one such page of these documents. We can see who it's from, the date, what it's for, and the amount. And there's plenty more in the document files. So the dossier continues. As the contracts, proposals, reports, letters, and other documents reveal, Soon relied exclusively on grants from the fossil fuel industry for his entire salary and research budget. Particularly troubling, the Smithsonian Institute entered into funding agreements that gave Soon's funders the right to review his scientific studies before they were published. The documents also show that the Smithsonian agreed not to disclose the funding agreement without the funders' permission. Soon reported his research articles and even his congressional testimony to his corporate underwriters as deliverables. While requirements for disclosing funding sources vary across disciplines and institutions, scientists generally expect one another to be transparent about their funding sources and to uphold scientific integrity by ensuring that funders do not interfere with or predetermine research results. The released documents clearly show a corporate intent to deceive. Although Soon's research methodology and conclusions have been widely criticized and discredited by his scientific peers, ExxonMobil and Southern Company clearly saw value in directly and secretly funding Soon. Politicians and interest groups backed by the fossil fuel industry have promoted Soon's work for years to spread doubt about the role of human-caused emissions in climate change. Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, for instance, prominently mentioned Soon's work on the U.S. Senate website in a section on the facts of science of climate change. From the start, despite the covert funding, Soon sought to portray his research as independent, and his affiliation with the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics has lent it an air of credibility. The fact that he was paid by fossil fuel interests was never publicly disclosed in his published work or testimony to lawmakers. According to the New York Times, at least 11 papers published by Soon since 2008 omit any disclosure of this clear conflict of interest. They were funding him up until his association came to light in 2015. That was 10, 11 years ago, and 20 years after they already knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, what the real science says. Or consider $80 million that went from fossil fuel interests between 2004 and 2013 to groups and think tanks engaging in climate change denial, such as Heartland Institute, Americans for Prosperity, and the Committee for Constructive Tomorrow. Every single public-facing group that is denying climate change that you're aware of is being funded by corporate interests, because the reality of climate change is harming their business. Let's move on. The American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, a group that purports to stand for free market principles, provides a venue for industry groups to influence policymakers behind closed doors. Leaked internal documents show that ALEC, backed by many industry groups including many major fossil fuel companies such as Chevron, ExxonMobil, Peabody Energy, and Shell, continues to serve as an important conduit for climate misinformation and policy proposals designed to block climate action today. ALEC's current official position obscures climate change by calling it a historical phenomenon, ignoring the primary driver of climate change today, the burning of fossil fuels, and asserts that the debate will continue on the significance of natural and anthropogenic contributions. While downplaying the impacts of climate change, ALEC has been working to block climate action at the federal and state level since the 1990s and was named in the API Roadmap memo as a participating organization or fund allocator. Leaked external documents reveal the extent of ALEC's misinformation. For example, ALEC's 2014 annual meeting in Dallas featured a presentation by Joseph Bast, president of the Heartland Institute, a group with a long history of misrepresenting science that is probably best known for posting a billboard likening people who accept climate science to the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski. The billboard featured a mugshot of a disheveled Kaczynski with the text, "I still believe in global warming. Do you?" This is insane! It's absolutely hilarious on the face of it. It feels like some absurd parody that you'd find in a Fallout game or Futurama. If this was satire, I'd laud it as brilliant, but it is somehow genuine, and for that, sad. Aside from that, the Heartland Institute prepared a presentation for the ALEC meeting. This included lies and misconstruals, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a project of the United Nations, is not a credible source of science or economics. IPCC bias number 1. Climate change is a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. IPCC bias number 2. We are an intergovernmental body and we do what the governments of the world want us to do. If the governments decided we should do things differently and come up with a vastly different set of products, we would be at their beck and call. NIPCC, or non-governmental, formed in 2003 by Professor Fred Singer, partnership of 3 organizations, the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Climate Change, Science and Environmental Policy Project, the Heartland Institute. What the NIPCC scientists found: there is no scientific consensus on the human role in climate change. Future warming due to human greenhouse gases will be much less than IPCC forecasts. Carbon dioxide has not caused weather to become more extreme, polar ice and sea ice to melt, or sea level rise to accelerate. These were all false alarms. The likely benefits of man-made global warming exceed the likely costs. I'm sorry, this is just... It's so patently ridiculous that it really is funny. Frustrating, don't get me wrong, it's very frustrating. But, God, literally everything you hear parroted online nowadays all just comes from these same groups. What this means for public policy. Global warming is not a crisis. The threat was exaggerated. There is no need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and no point in attempting to do so. It's time to repeal unnecessary and expensive policies. Future policies should aim at fostering economic growth to adapt to natural climate change. Rein in EPA. I have come to believe that the national EPA must be systematically dismantled and replaced by a committee of the whole of the 50 state environmental protection agencies. Guess who said that? Yeah, the science director of the Heartland Institute again. Oppose carbon pricing. Oppose carbon taxes. Oppose cap-and-trade schemes. Oppose Obama's plan to regulate CO2 as a pollutant. ALEC model bills. Resolution in opposition to a carbon tax. Resolution concerning EPA proposed greenhouse gas emission standards for new and existing fossil fuel powered plants. Resolution in response to EPA's plan to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. Stop subsidizing alternative energy. Repeal renewable power mandates. Repeal renewable energy subsidies. Oppose net metering provisions that burden consumers. Isn't it funny that they just never want to repeal gas and oil and coal subsidies? Huh. I wonder why that is. At the same meeting, ALEC featured a talk by David Rothbard, a contributor to API's Global Climate Science Communications team in 1988, and then president of the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. Rothbard's presentation, Climate Science Talking Points 2014, began with the outright falsehood that the scientific reality is that on virtually every claim, from A to Z, the claims of the promoters of man-made climate fears are falling short or going in the opposite direction. Sponsors of the 2014 ALEC annual meeting included ACCCE, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Peabody Energy. Today, ALEC's Energy, Environment, and Agricultural Task Force continues to distribute sample legislation to state legislators that they can easily introduce to oppose EPA carbon emission standards and attempt to roll back successful renewable energy standards and multi-state climate initiatives, such as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the northeastern United States. In a leaked resolution adopted in 2007, ALEC urged the EPA not to regulate global warming emissions from cars and trucks, claiming that there was a lack of evidence that human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases will endanger public health or welfare. Between 2013 and 2015, some 65 ALEC-sponsored bills introduced in the state legislatures were designed to roll back or repeal state standards requiring utilities to increase their use of renewable energy. In 2011, ALEC publicly took credit for 13 states adopting resolutions in opposition to the EPA's plans to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. ALEC's Environmental Literacy Improvement Act has provided a template for attempts to legislate content contrary to accepted climate science into school curricula. This behavior is, of course, not unique to the early 2010s and late 2000s. This has been their strategy the whole time. Just 3 years after their internal absolute certainty in the science, the American Petroleum Institute distributed a memo. Global Science Communications Action Plan. Project Goal. A majority of the American public, including industry leadership, recognizes that significant uncertainties exist in climate science, and therefore raises questions among those, e.g. Congress, who chart the future U.S. course on global climate change. Progress will be measured toward the goal. A measurement of the public's perspective on climate science will be taken before the plan is launched, and the same measurement will be taken at one or more as yet to be determined intervals as the plan is implemented. Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand, recognize uncertainties in climate science. Recognition of uncertainties become part of the conventional wisdom. Media understands, recognizes uncertainties in climate science. Media coverage reflect balance on climate science and recognition of the validity of viewpoints that challenge the current conventional wisdom. Industry senior leadership understands uncertainties in climate science, making them stronger ambassadors to those who shape climate policy. Those promoting the Kyoto Treaty on the basis of extant science appear to be out of touch with reality. Current reality. Unless climate change becomes a non-issue, meaning that the Kyoto proposal is defeated and there are no further initiatives to thwart the threat of climate change, there may be no moment when we can declare victory for our efforts. It will be necessary to establish measurements for the science effort to track progress toward achieving the goal and strategic success. Their strategies included identifying and training 5 new scientists and media outreach, specifically those who do not have history of visibility or communication in the climate change debate, undermining the conventional wisdom on climate science, produce and distribute a steady stream of climate science information to journalists, news networks, and science communicators nationwide, using grassroots organizations to conduct workshops and outreach at strategic locations to change opinion on the, at the time, upcoming Kyoto Protocol, advertising the uncertainties in select markets as necessary to change public opinion, identifying and establishing cooperative relationships with all major scientists whose research supports our position, working to amplify their stances as much as possible among the media and administration, providing grants for advocacy of these positions, directly educate politicians, teachers, and students, and using grassroots organizations to distribute educational materials directly to schools, all to the tune of $5 million. Which would be $10 million today. How did they measure their success? Various metrics will be used to track progress. These measurements will have to be determined in fleshing out the action plan and may include baseline public governmental official opinion surveys and periodic follow-up surveys on the percentage of American government officials who recognize significant uncertainties in climate science, tracking the percent of media articles that raise questions about climate science, number of members of Congress exposed to our materials on climate science, number of communications on climate science received by members of Congress from their constituents, number of radio talk show appearances by scientists questioning the prevailing wisdom, number of school teachers/students reached with our information on climate science, number of science writers briefed and who report upon climate science uncertainties, total audience exposed to newspaper, radio, television coverage of science uncertainties. In 2009, API created an AstroTurf group known as Energy Citizens that gave the public appearance of a grassroots organization opposing the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009. Of course, there was no such grassroots organizing. It was all funded by the API, with testimonies given by lobbyists appearing as concerned everyday citizens. And a leaked memo even revealed API urging its members, such as Exxon and Chevron et al., to send their employees to the staged rallies. The Western States Petroleum Association, WSPA, is very self-explanatory. It is a petroleum interest group serving the western US states. Counted among its members are all the names we're familiar with. In 2014, they had a presentation at one of their meetings. Of course, this got leaked to the public. In it, we see that the astroturfing goes a lot further than Energy Citizens. It is a consistent playbook to create and fund completely fake grassroots groups and try and convince politicians that they're actually concerned citizens. To see just how convincing they are, let's play a game. I'm going to list some names of some citizen groups, some real and some funded or created by the WSPA. Your job is to determine which is which. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Local hydraulic fracturing campaigns. Concerned mineral owners of California. Californians against higher oil taxes. Californians for energy independence. Current Citizens for Energy. California Drivers Alliance. Fed up at the pump. Fueling California. California Fuel Facts. Californians against higher taxes. Save our jobs. Tank the tax. Californians for affordable and reliable energy. Washington consumers for sound fuel policy. Oregonians for sound fuel policy. And AB 32 Implementation Group. Take your time and go back through them and go forward when you have your answer. The reveal, the winner of the big bucks is, they're all fake. Just let that sink in for a few minutes. All of those. You might even heard of some of these. They're all fake. But you know what's worse than pouring millions of dollars into astroturfing? How about literally just forging letters to Congress from actual real organizations? In 2009, Congress was debating the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009, often known as the Waxman-Markey Climate Bill, which proposed to institute a federal carbon emissions reduction plan. 2 weeks prior to the vote, Representative Tom Perello from Virginia received a letter opposing the legislation from Crescendo Juntas, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, a nonprofit Latino organization based in his Charlottesville district. My organization, Crescendo Juntas, represents minorities in your district, the letter began. We ask you to use your important position to help protect minorities and other consumers in your district from higher electricity bills. Please don't vote to force cost increases on us, especially in this volatile economy. Only after the vote on the bill did Rep. Perello learn from Crescendo Juntas that the letter was a fraud. As it turns out, the letter on Crescendo Juntas stationery was not the only forgery, and Representative Perello was not the only member of Congress to receive forged letters opposing the bill. Forged letters were sent purportedly on behalf of organizations including the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the American Association of University Women, the American Legion, and their Jefferson Area Board of Aging. Fraudulent letters were also sent to Representatives Kathy, a name I cannot pronounce, and Chris Carney. The actual organizations that had their identity fraudulently stolen held actively oppositional stances to what these letters said. Their likeness was used in order to sway a vote against what the actual American public wanted. In the rightful investigation that followed, the PR firm responsible for these letters, who was hired by the oil interests, claimed that the letters were from a rogue employee and the heads of the firm weren't aware. Later, they would admit that they did know about the fraudulent letters and didn't inform the targets until after the vote. And the people willing to report on all of this? Harassed, threatened, then murdered, locked away. The victims of their environmental destruction forever scarred and forever without compensation. All of that for that sweet, sweet bottom line. The only conspiracy afoot is the industry giants who stand to lose everything if the truth is accepted, and so do anything to prevent that. It takes a lot less money to put out verifiably false advertisements than it does to buy out every single scientist the world over. So that's what they did. Everything you have ever heard about climate change being fake was, at one point, a product of the fossil fuels industry. Everyone you have heard saying such things were paid, or believed people that were paid, or believed in lies and faked credentials. There are no scientists that reject anthropogenic climate change, only a small group of people who were paid and then their phony results amplified by the media apparatus. Until the public was convinced. Because that's all they had to do. Every talking point was something they sold you, and the only price they asked was the destruction of your children's future. I implore you to find any talking point against climate change that didn't originate from the industry most incentivized to lie about it. And lie and deceive they did. They knew all along the truth. They just didn't want you to know. If you knew, you'd care. And when the people care about their own health, or for their family, or for humanity, that's bad for business. Anthropogenic at Last is a misnomer. It was always anthropogenic. I hope you understand that now. I hope you're angry. I hope you're furious, and I hope it's a righteous fury, and that you understand that fury, however righteous, is worthless without action. I hope the planet we inhabit is worth more to you than money drenched in oil and stained with innocent blood.